So hi Jose, how are you?
Hi, Sarina, how are you? Good,
Uh,
good.
I'm good too. Thank you so much for asking, and thank you for joining us. It's an honor for us to have you here, and thank you so much for taking out time from your busy schedule. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Jose Manuel. He is a CCO, therapeutic area leader on cohematology from Roche Pharmaceuticals, and he is having an experience of 20 plus years, and he is working with Roche since 2007. So he will be sharing his thoughts on diversity and inclusion in clinical trials for oncology. So let's learn from his experience and expertise.
Thank you, Sarina. I am going to share my screen with my slides.
Sure. Thank you.
Can you see my screen, my slides?
Yes, I can perfectly see it.
Perfect. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And firstly, I would like to thank the organization to invite me to this meeting with the focus on how to optimize the research in oncology. My name is José Manuel Ordoñez. I am working for Roche since 2007. Previously, I was working in a hospital as medical oncologist, and now I am managing clinical trials in clinical operations in Spain. When I receive a new protocol, my first view is to review the inclusion and exclusion criteria to know if patients with diabetes can be recruited. I was diagnosed in 2007 of diabetes, and for me, it's very interesting to know if patients as me can be part of the studies. Diversity and inclusion are some of the most relevant topics speaking about research due to different aspects. I would like to share with you some thoughts about this topic, about diversity and inclusion in research. It's huge, the number of papers published recently, and in my presentation, I want to show some comments, firstly, about disparities in cancer care. I will speak about cancer, but these aspects can be applied in other diseases. Secondly, some ideas on clinical research provided by Health Equity Committee by ASCO, the American Association of Medical Oncology. Here, working in decreasing the disparities, we are not alone. There are other stakeholders where we can support as FDA and EMA, the European medical to approve our drugs. And finally, I would like to share with you some experiences in my company, Roche. Over the past decade, despite novel diagnostics and therapeutics, together with changes in the cancer care delivery system, cancer disparities persist. Our understanding of the population experiencing disparate outcomes has likewise expanded to include the intersections of race, ethnicity, geography, sexual orientation, and gender identity, social demographic factors, and others. ASCO, the American Association of Medical Oncology, in 2009, committed to addressing differences in address outcomes in its original policy statement on cancer disparities. This update statement affirms ASCO's commitment to moving beyond descriptions of differences in cancer outcomes toward achievement on cancer health equity with focus on improving equitable access to care, addressing structural barriers, increasing the awareness, and improving clinical research. In my opinion, when we think about diversity and inclusion, our first thought is about race and immigrants. But these terms are much wider, and it's necessary to open the scope and consider other different aspects at sex, gender, age, social determinants of health, for example.
Sorry to interrupt you, but some attendees are saying that your slides are not changing. So are you still on the first slide or?
No, I am moving my slides.
Okay, can you please go on the presentation mode? Because I think you need to reshare your screen. Maybe then it will work.
I am going to.
Can you share again your screen?
Yeah, I am going to share with you my my screen.
Okay. Okay, can you please go on the presentation mode here at the bottom? Okay.
Here now?
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, so okay, great. Yes, now it's moving.
It's moving?
Yes.
Okay, I am going to try to. Perfect.
Okay.
As I said previously, ASCO Throat Health Equity Committee described 4 focus areas, and one of these areas is to ensure equitable research based on the study of the cancer disparities in the US. Access to cancer clinical trials remains inadequate for underrepresented minorities, but again, we need to review our ideas when we hear minorities, because underrepresented populations in clinical trials are patients with renal or hepatic failure, for example. They describe several actions where all the stakeholders can work to achieve the goal, to ensure equitable research. Some actions are described here as promote policy system environments and practice to improve equitable participation in all research, require routine collection and public reporting of research data on variables known to influence cancer outcomes, for example. Nevertheless, despite efforts over the past decade by policymakers and stakeholders to equalize cancer outcomes, treatment and mortality remains associated with different factors described in my previous slides. Approaches that examine how different dimensions of a person's identity intersect to affect health outcomes are needed to develop effective strategies for reducing the disparities. Here, I want to share with you some strategies in relation to clinical research. Firstly, disease care, not only in cancer, is more complex and personalized. The research through which new advances are developed must include the representation of all populations who stand to benefit. Given the lack of evidence-based care among many populations, gains in achieving health equity will be limited if new drugs continue to be developed with research that does not include representation from all populations. Here, all different stakeholders, patients, caregivers, advocacy groups, health authorities, and of course, pharmaceutical companies can work together to achieve this goal. The publication of these efforts should be very valuable during the review process of the new papers, but for this, it's necessary to collect and report the data. Routine collection and reporting of data regarding demographic and clinical characteristics can increase the likelihood that research will acknowledge and potentially address health disparities. These elements are necessary to understand differences in treatment effectiveness, tolerance, and outcomes in our patients. Here, the role of the investigators is key, in my opinion. The role of the journals is essential too. I want to share with you a paper published by one of the most prestigious journals, New England Journal of Medicine, and its thoughts about including this information in the papers published into the journal. The 1st of January of this year, the authors of research studies need to prepare an additional table that provides background information on the disease, problem, or condition. And of course, it's necessary to include the representativeness of the study group. And it's necessary to add the representation of minorities to publish in this journal in New England. The involvement of all different stakeholders working in clinical trials is key, and work together thinking about novel strategies to improve the recruitment and retention of diverse representation in research. Understanding the existing barriers to research participation, including novel strategies as informed consent methods that are more accessible to participants using visual icons and videos, for example. Social media and use of patient-centered recruitment messaging to assist with underrepresented patient recruitment, in my opinion, is very useful too. We have two relevant stakeholders in this task, in this work: the FDA and the EMA. And I want to share with you some comments published by the main health authorities in this case as partners. FDA published a guideline for pharmaceutical companies to improve the enrollment from underrepresented racial and ethnic population in clinical trials. The purpose of this guideline is to provide some recommendation on the approach, race and ethnicity diversity plan to enroll this type of populations in our clinical trials. And you can see in this slide the recommendation of the FDA to seek feedback from this agency regarding the applicable pivotal trials for the drug, mainly during the end of phase 2 meeting. Tell me, Sarina.
I'm so sorry, but I can see your fourth slide and it's still on the person. Should I share my screen? Because I have your slides and I can move your slides for you.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
I am going to.
Okay, just let me share my screen. Okay, so can you please tell me on which slide you are?
Yeah, the next slide, please.
Okay, just wait for a second.
Sarina, are you going to share the slides?
Yes, I'm going to start.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank
Right?
you. Yeah, thank you. The recommendations of the FDA are to collect and to analyze of racial and ethnic data, increasing or to describe a broadening of eligibility criteria when scientifically is it possible. Develop a plan that outlines the operational measures that will be implemented to ensure diverse clinical trial participation to improve the generation of evidence to treat different populations with the drug after the approval of this drug. The next slide, please. And this one is the experience in European region. The EMA has launched a registry to explore the different inequalities in cancer on the 2nd of February of this year. This registry has 3 different elements. A data tool, currently this part of the registry is available to explore and compare different indicators. Reports focusing on the assessment of the country-specific situation, speaking about diversity and inclusion, and the inequalities in cancer in the different countries in this region, and analytical reports comparing the performance at a European level. Next slide. Organizations should also work to assist clinicians and other stakeholders to achieve equitable, diverse representation in research. To achieve the recommendation in this section, there is also a need for a quality data management infrastructure to support research activities, address financial barriers to participation in research, and promote to research in underrepresented areas. Next slide, please. Roche, a pharmaceutical company and a stakeholder of clinical research, is very interested in this aspect, diversity and inclusion, and how to increase underrepresented populations and different areas in our clinical trials, decreasing the disparities between population and areas, and not only focus on cancer. Is a transversal initiative developed by a working group from all areas in the company. It's very difficult to summarize our commitment in diversity and inclusion, but these are some points in relation to our commitment. The example to expand clinical trials access to underrepresented populations, develop personalized healthcare solutions that reflect individual differences in gender, age, and environment, for example. Next slide, please. Here, some initiatives where we are working to achieve our goals and our commitment. There is a group mainly in the US. This group is called as Advancing Inclusive Research Initiative, where we are working with some sites to develop some initiatives to increase the diversity and inclusion in our clinical trials. It's necessary to know the current status of the diversity in our research studies. And for example, in my country, in Spain, we had a meeting with different stakeholders to know the situation of the inclusion of these different populations in our clinical trials. And in summary, the population from other race or from other countries in our clinical trials in Spain, the percentage of these patients is very low. And we want to increase these patients, the possibility to recruit in our clinical trials these patients. Another initiative is to decrease educational inequalities, mainly focusing on the informed consent and patient-centered recruitment campaigns to make easier to our patients to be involved in the clinical trials, not only for the patients living in our country, mainly for patients living in other countries or speaking other languages, translating the informed consent to the native language for people not living or speaking other language in our country. Operational aspects involving our clinical trials, mainly to reduce the financial burdens, increasing or having a broad inclusion and exclusion criteria. And one initiative working in Roche currently to increase the number of patients from rural areas. Usually the patients or the clinical trials are in a big hospital, and these type of hospitals are not in rural areas. And we want to give the opportunity to be involved in our clinical trials, not only people living in big cities. It's necessary to have people from small cities and people living in rural areas. And this one is only some initiatives where we are working in the company. There are other initiatives, country by country, to increase these populations in our clinical trials. Next slide, please. Finally, in a nutshell, my summary about this presentation: despite novel diagnostics and therapeutics, disparities persist, and not only based on race and ethnicity. Currently, we have a lot of disparities in our clinical trials. As part of our support to society, we need to ensure equitable access to research to improve the access to the innovation to all patients. It's necessary to have information, to have scientific information about all different situations that we are going to have in the hospitals. It's necessary to know if this drug is useful for a patient with a hepatic failure. And usually in our clinical trials, these patients are excluded due to the inclusion and exclusion criteria. But we need to have this information to provide these patients the opportunity to be treated with one drug. And we need to include, or we need to have the tools to include these patients to have this information from these patients. The situation is different between countries, and every country should evaluate the disparities to apply the solutions. In this group, in my experience working in Roche, the situation of the countries in the north of Europe are completely different than the situation in countries in the south, because the health system is different, and other reasons that are impacted in the situation about diversity and inclusion in our clinical trials. And everybody is part of this incredible adventure. And the key is to experiment and to share the information, to share the experiments with the rest of the stakeholders, to avoid reinventing the wheel, and to increase these patients in our clinical trials, to have these patients other opportunities to be treated with new drugs. And in my opinion, to share the experiments, to discuss about these different approaches to increase these populations in our clinical trials, in my opinion, is very, very useful, with one main goal: our patients. Next slide, please. Well, this one is my last slide. Thank you for your time, and I don't know if we have some minutes, if you have some questions to ask.
Hi, Jose. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, and I hope everyone here have enjoyed your session. And we still have a few minutes, so I will ask the audience that if someone is having any question related to Jose's presentation, you can drop us the questions in chat or in the QA session. And we have received a question for you, Jose. So, what could be the role of clinical teams to increase the diversity?
In my opinion, the role of the clinical teams is huge, because it's necessary to create the awareness of this situation, to have in our mind when we are in front of a patient, to give the opportunity to this patient to be included in a clinical trial. I think that, firstly, we need to think about the diversity and inclusion in our clinical trials, and to have this approach in our mind. It's not only in the pharmaceutical companies to have a broader inclusion and exclusion criteria. I think that our partners in the hospital to recruit these patients are the staff, are the oncologists, and is the oncologist the main person to recruit a patient. And if the oncologists have in their mind this approach, diversity and inclusion, in my opinion, we are going to increase the percentage of these populations in our clinical trials.
Okay, great. Thank you